South Sulawesi upsets ideas about Indonesian history.
Wow. Do you want to introduce it?
I will introduce
So
you.
you're going to
Yeah,
introduce-
yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Well, it's who I am. So I thought, well, no, people just know who I am.
I'll make sure they know who you are. I think they know who you are. But
Don't want to be anybody these days.
yeah. Do you mean like when people, yeah, like some Indonesian students sometimes they call me Ibu Dr. Eva. No, just call me Eva. And that's even good because sometimes in Indonesia they call me so no. Well,
No, just the Vice Chancellor's secretary was Mrs. Donaldson, Queen Mary's mother, the real mother, who she tragically died. Queen Mary's mother.
Okay,
So
this bro. Okay. Okay, right. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you joining online from Indonesia. A very warm welcome to the ISG seminar. Please allow me to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, from whose traditional lands the ANU campus rests, and pay our respect to the elders past and present. I'm Ivanisa. I'll be chairing today's seminar. And today we are very lucky to have Professor Campbell McKnight with us to present a fascinating talk titled How South Sulawesi Upsets Ideas About Indonesian History. I just told Campbell, I love the title. Okay, right. A few housekeeping notes before we start. This is also an online event. So those of you who are joining online, we will be taking questions after the presentations. And online audience, you can write your questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and our wonderful Indonesia project team will read them out. Right, and now I will briefly introduce our speaker. We are very fortunate, we are very lucky to have Professor Campbell McKnight. Professor Campbell McKnight is an honorary professor in the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the Australian National University, and also Professor Emeritus at the University of Tasmania. And he has studied the history of South Sulawesi for more than 50 years and has published extensively about Bugis philology and also the early history of the region. So again, we are very lucky to have Professor Campbell McKnight. Please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Professor Campbell McKnight.
Well, thank you, Eva, for that introduction. It's good to be talking to the Indonesia Study Group again. I last addressed the Indonesia Study Group, noticed on the 12th of September, 1968. So I've been to many since.
So you've got a really good memory, Campbell.
Record keeping. But it seems time for an update. Because the following year, in 1969, I first went to South Sulawesi with John Mulvaney and Arpe Suyono in connection with prehistoric archaeology. I already knew enough about the place, however, to ask to see the local manuscripts. And here, I get it right. Am I really? Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Here's a historic photo taken in 1969 of the collection of the Yayasan Kebudayaan, or the pre-war Matestikting, laid out for me on this table. And it also allows me to acknowledge Abdurrahim, the man on the left, and Andi Abubakar Punagi on the right, who provided key assistance in due course, and Pabitei, who looked after the manuscripts, the old man in the centre. Because I understood from reading the work of the Dutch scholars Senser and Nordijn that some of these manuscripts related to pre-colonial times. That's before 1600 AD or CE. On the same trip in Bantang, south of Makassar, I saw this table of Chinese, Thai, and Vietnamese ceramics in the Bupati's office. All these had been excavated from pre-Islamic graves within a radius of a few hundred metres from the office, and many date to the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, looking for a long-term research project after my PhD on fishermen from Makassar who visited North Australia in the 18th and 19th centuries, I conceived the possibility of combining the evidence of the manuscripts and the data from the ceramics. And that's more or less what we've been doing since. I say we because a loose gang of colleagues, both Indonesian and non-Indonesian, have worked very happily and productively together. Let's begin with the chronology. There's, first of all, prehistory. And I said that's super exciting, led again with good archaeologists from Australia, especially Griffith. The Hobbit's cousin is somewhere in Sulawesi. They can find the stone tools, but not yet the bones. But about 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens arrived on their way to Australia. And about 3,500 years ago, Austronesian speakers arrived. Then we have stuff about history from about 1600 on. Islam arrived officially in 1605. There was clearly some Muslims there a bit before that. Goa in the south became dominant, and you can see the rest. Note particularly that the Dutch colonial period after the VOC departed the scene, the Dutch only really controlled a small area just around Makassar. They didn't control much of South Sulawesi until 1905 or thereabouts, when things really got underway. But in history, the latest news is Heather Sutherland's new book on the history of Makassar, which has just appeared. And what's important to note is that for much of the peninsula, the colonial period didn't really begin until the early 20th century. Local states maintained a high degree of independence until that time. And the traces of traditional nobility are still evident, and modern Kabupaten still reflect the boundaries of the old kingdoms. In between, there's what might be called proto-history. That's a fine term. I assure you that I am certificated from the ANU as having a PhD in proto-history. They had to ring me up and ask me what I wanted. But I'm beginning to call it just early history because we now know so much about it, with information from written records going back to the 14th century. Then there's the geography, very quickly. Points to notice here, the old volcanoes in the north and the south. They're not on the map, but you can see where the rivers end up. They've contributed to the fertile soil of the Great Central Valley in the peninsula. Notice also the division between the Makassar speakers as people speaking the Makassar language with one S, and the Bugis speakers. The languages are quite distinct, though the cultures are roughly comparable. Think of Portuguese and Spanish, something like that. That's a good analogy of it. Notice also the position of Makassar down on the bottom left-hand corner. Makassar with two S's, which is now the official name of the city. And we won't go into the tangled history of that. But the city is named after the people. And it's relatively open to contact by sea, and it's isolated from the Bugis areas of the interior. And notice the various states or kingdoms, both Bugis and Makassar. I'm going to be talking about Wajo, Bone here, Wajo there, Sopeng there, Goa down there, Luwu up there. I think they're most of the ones I name. So let's get on to it. Substance. South Sulawesi gets little mention in the general histories of Indonesia, and nor does it feature in a sense of the national past. While one can suggest other reasons, this is mainly because the history of South Sulawesi was not much known to people who wrote the general histories. And this is something which really should be changed and should be updated. And there are three matters which I maintain are now worth including in any new history of Indonesia or account of the Indonesian identity. These are things which should be added in. Now, the first is simply the narrative of what has happened in South Sulawesi since about 1200 AD or CE, and a discussion of the driving forces behind that narrative. Let me just pick out, more or less at random, some examples of events and causes, of things that could be put into a general history that aren't there at the moment. Now, as a good Austronesian-speaking society, almost anything and everything is driven by precedence or ascriptive status. But the term precedence is useful because it allows one to distinguish this from other forms of status. It's a term that's very familiar out of ANU and Jim Fox's Austronesian project in Michael Fisher's book, which is just called Precedence, I think. One's precedence depends on the precedence of both one's parents. Now, here's one of my favourite stories. In about 1410, so this is really pre-colonial, in about 1410, La Umasa, the second king of Bone, had two sons by a commoner mother. Over there, La Umasa, but the commoner mother produced Tosuwale and Tosalawaka. Clearly, they could not succeed him because their mother was a commoner. But his sister, down the road in Palaka, who also claimed his own, who of course had equal precedence with La Umasa, here's Patanronua over here, with the same parents. The sister, who had equal precedence, was pregnant to the king of Palaka, who also claimed his own precedence from a descended one. That was the king, and he had a descent independently. So that the baby, which was to be born of this marriage, would have really top-level precedence from both the king of Palaka and the king of Bone's sister. Now, the 17th century Chronicle of Bone explains how the king of Bone sent his two sons to steal the baby as soon as it was born and bring it and the afterbirth back to Bone, where the afterbirth could be buried to establish the baby as a Bone baby. Then the Bone king, Laumasa, abdicated in favour of the baby, who was immediately installed in the office of the king of Bone. The chronicle, 250 years after the event, explains the elaborate charade which then ensued. One of the brothers who'd stolen the baby held the baby. The other presented matters to be decided, and the baby holder delivered the decision of the baby. Even the former king had to ask permission if he wanted to do anything. This setup lasted until the baby came of age with women, when he took up power for himself and engaged in a very active reign totaling 72 years in all. So Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth got upped. Notice how precedence trumps the biological descent of the sons and the importance of holding the office of king. Notice too how we have names, rough dates, specific locations, and the elements of a political system. Another story. The system is wonderfully summed up in the comment by a representative of Sopeng, the series of meetings held in 1763 to deal with an urgent problem. Bone, Wajo, and Sopeng all agreed that something had to be done about Lamadukalan, but what and why exactly? Now, Lamadukalan had quite a history. Born in Wajo, he came of high noble birth. He had high precedence and had gone off to East Kalimantan as a young man in the 1720s, eventually becoming ruler of several small settlements. In 1735, he comes back to Sulawesi, becomes Arung Muktawa, or head ruler, if you like, head king of Wajo. So he has a very high office. He then quarrels with Bone, manages very nearly to expel the Dutch East India Company from Sulawesi altogether in an attack on the Dutch fort in Makassar. He gets replaced as Arung Matoa, his office. He gets kicked out of that in 1754, but hangs on in the office of ruler of a small territory in Wajo. By 1763, he's still causing trouble, so the meetings are called. What are we going to do about this thug? At the fourth meeting, on Tuesday, the 7th of June, 1763, Arung Ujung from Sopeng, in the course of a long, confused discussion, remarks, according to our Rapang, that is the administrative law of each kingdom, according to Rapang, this whole matter we're talking about does not concern external affairs. Ranking is derived externally. Ranking is not derived internally. Now, the word translated ranking here is waring, derived from an Arabic word for inheritance, and it's used in other contexts in Indonesia today. But it catches exactly the sense of precedence. This sense could in fact serve as a slogan for South Sulawesi ethnography. Incidentally, the meeting solved nothing, and Lamadukalan died 3 years later. But notice the absence of Dutch interest or initiative in the story. This is 1763, when everyone thinks colonialism's going gangbusters. The Dutch were not interested at all. Other Austronesian-speaking societies go in for genealogical records in various forms, but the Bugis outdo them all from the 14th century until the present day. There are records of descent and precedence which go on for literally hundreds of pages. Indeed, we think the Makassar and Bugis learned to write in order to preserve and flaunt such records. I can prove that I'm better than you. And here's a relatively simple example. The ruling of Boné from the 13th century to the present. Notice the interweaving of the rulers of other kingdoms. Goa is red. That's the red one. Luwu is white somewhere. Sopeng is cream. Biru is blue, and so on. Wari can come from outside the kingdoms, just as the baby story came from Malacca. So people with high Wari can come and rule in Boné or get into the family story because it's recognised by all. Notice also, though the lines are a bit faint, right down here at the bottom, here are all the Bupatis since independence. And some of these, though we won't go into the details, go back and have noble heritage in the descent of Boné. And let's not forget that right up the top is is Karampalua, the baby who ruled for 72 years, right up at the top.
And what year was that?
Which one?
Well,
Well, it comes to today, down the bottom.
so it's very recent.
When was it?
Yes, it must have been done in the last 30, 40 years. I think I saw this in Boné in some office.
Right. Well, I mean, is it pre or post new order?
Oh, post new order.
Post.
Yeah. Or there would be others. There are lots of these everywhere. Now, initially, by analysing early genealogies like this, going back a few generations earlier than this one, Ian Caldwell, another good ANU PhD, has developed a new paradigm for the early history of the peninsula. A central role in this new paradigm is assigned to the kingdom of China, which exercised control over the fertile lands in the centre of the peninsula from the 13th century to the 16th century. You can date these through the genealogies because you've got to peg when people converted to Islam in the 17th century. You don't have to take it right up to today. China was then replaced by the kingdoms of Boné, Wajo and Sopeng and so forth from the 16th century on. The period of China's dominance saw two major developments. The first was the movement of Bugis speakers to the head of the Gulf of Boné in connection with the smelting of iron. Up here you can see this iron coming from the sources of iron up here, and Sorowako and all that. It's just off the map up here. And this explains this movement of Bugis speakers, which began around here, moved up the coast here, the very complicated linguistic situation in Luwu today. And there's also been a lot of very excellent and spectacular archaeology up here showing the iron industry. So that's one thing that happened in the time of China from basically the 13th century to about the 16th. The second was the expansion of wet rice agriculture down here in the fertile Central Valley, facilitated no doubt by the use of iron tools from Luwu. Suddenly people had iron tools which they could use quite cheaply. And there's abundant and diverse evidence of this from the 14th century on, both in the Central Plains here and down in this coastal plain down here in Makassar. And sites can be located and dated by ceramic sherdage, broken bits of pots everywhere. And David Bulbeck, another ANU PhD, has been responsible for devising the sophisticated statistics which underlie this archaeology, and for leading a massive effort of collecting sherds. David is a legend in Sulawesi. People say, if David doesn't come, who will know anything? But the productive agriculture of South Sulawesi provided then and now a surplus rice for export. Sulawesi produces rice. Now, the main settlement of China was at Alangkanange, here in Wajo today. And Alangkanange has good ceramic dating and supporting carbon dates from the 13th century to the 17th century. And the site, which is on a low hill out in the countryside, contributes to attract visitors and like this. And the number of small shrines, all the governors in the background are little houses, shrines to various things. These small shrines have greatly increased since I first visited there 50 years ago. 50 years ago, which was the time of the Grombolan and the great difficulty and so forth, there weren't many. But today people come because it's a place worth visiting. And you can also have a nice picnic. Above all, the memory of China is preserved in Lagaligo. Langkanange, which means the palace site in Bugis, is the site of the palace of Wei Chudai, the princess of China. And this brings us to the second great gift of Sulawesi to Indonesia's understanding of its history and its identity, and, in the words of UNESCO, to the memory of the world. Lagaligo is big news. Lagaligo is, or was, a cycle of linked stories or episodes held in the mind of an oral performer. The performer can then, when requested, perform this or that episode. If you're having a wedding or something like that, you go to the performer and say, I want this episode, please. So the performer can then, on request, perform this or that episode. There's no fixed text, and each performance will be slightly different, but both performer and audience know the overall shape of the narrative. The stories are set in real locations, notably China and Luwu, though geography is often a bit weak. An enormous cast of characters, hundreds of characters, across 7 generations, sail around the archipelago, fight, play, and above all, marry or seek to marry. It reflects an ideal Bugis society in which precedents derived from origins in the upper world and the lower world count for everything, and individuals in the middle world strive to demonstrate exactly that. They strive to demonstrate their precedents. It is a tribal encyclopedia, a phrase that's been used much elsewhere. It's a tribal encyclopedia par excellence, and wholly Austronesian. Wholly Austronesian. Now, a performer commands great skill in telling the episode, the moment, in an antique form of Bugis, patterned into 5-syllable elements and with tricks of parallelism, standard phrases, and so on. It's classic Parian Lord on the composition of Homer. If there are classicists around, Parian Lord is transformed. We now know how Homer was written. But Lagaligo is a much, much better example. Everything fits the theory perfectly. So then, and in my view, about 1700 AD, performers discovered that with the wonderful Bugis script, which we'll come to in a moment, they could perform on paper. They could perform on paper. They could write words down and become writing performers of what was still an individual performance. Now, this produced a text which could be a little higher quality, a little more polished, perhaps, than in various ways than they would deliver if it was just an oral performance. It also produced a manuscript which others could read at leisure. And why stop at a few pages? In fact, we have oceans of Lagaligo manuscripts. Many are copies of other manuscripts, of course, but also independent versions of many episodes. And in recent years, several thousand pages of transcription and Indonesian translation have been published. Thousands of pages, and that's just a beginning. Just a beginning. These are big, thick books. Here's one volume of an original. And I'm happy to report it's in Leiden in the library. It's all transcribed, translated, published, digitized, and inscribed on the UNESCO Register of the History of the Memory of the World. But this is only just one of 12 volumes in one set, as it were. Lagaligo scholarship flourishes, to say nothing of novels, poems, paintings, dances, and so on, using the overall storyline. Most notably, there was the opera. I think opera is probably the best word to describe it. Masterminded by Robert Wilson out of the New York theatre scene. It toured the world. I saw it in the State Theatre in Melbourne in 2006. But after its earlier premiere in Singapore, it played in at least a dozen cities in Europe and America. Has anyone seen it? Did anyone see it?
The one in Japan, yes.
You saw the one? Now, of course, the Robert Wilson show was a simplified and stylized telling of the story. It was not authentic in the sense of being a revival of what would once have been. It did, however, have excellent local advice and input. It wasn't a rip-off. But it was also a magical 3 hours with magnificent staging, brilliant and specially commissioned music, amazing dance and acting. It was a rendition of the ideal world of Lagaligo. Here surely was the most significant projection of Indonesian culture and history in years, round the world. But I'm not sure, however, how much of it in all the publicity was seen as Indonesian and not just exoticism from some faraway land. If you were sitting in Austin in Texas or Lyon in France, how did it show up as Indonesian? My own dream for Lagaligo is a literary analysis of a substantial body of text to show how the performance is constructed. How should we read the text? How should we judge the performer of this version in contrast with another performer of the same episode? And so on. Is the authentic Lagaligo any good? And there's more than one PhD thesis in that, it seems to me. You'll notice in the slide that the text is written in funny little scribbles. Don't worry that you can't discern them too clearly. This is Bugis Lontara script, the world's most efficient script, and in my view, one of Indonesia's most cunning inventions, at least in respect of text in Bugis and Makassar. Where did it come from, and when and why? And these are questions which have puzzled generations of scholars, but to which I think we now have answers. And this is the third matter worth celebrating. Ultimately, it's an indic script. That is, it's an axary. Axary is a very useful new word. It's made up of signs called akshara in Sanskrit, which represent a consonant and a vowel. is consonant and vowel. It's not K, it's Ka. And this vowel can then be changed by a mark above, below, before, or behind the aksara. So it can be Ka or Ki, Ku, Ke, Ko, or Ko. It is not an alphabet or a syllabary. And the very first job in learning Bugis is to learn the very distinctive order of the aksaras. Ka ga nga, ka pa ba ma, pa ta da na, cha ja nya, cha yara wasa aha. See, my each knows. Everyone, you just have to learn that off by heart. Now let me lay out in very simple terms where I think this system came from. What is it? That way, I was just, these were meant to be the aksaras there that come up from. Anyway, step one concerns another script used for writing Makassar language and called Old Makassar or Jangan Jangan, that is bird script. But to go back even further, among the scripts in Sumatra, which clearly predate Islam, even if we don't have old specimens, there is the Lampung script, which we know from the 19th century. And if we cast our minds to the 14th century, back to the 14th century, there were various reasons for people from Makassar to be in touch with southeast Sumatra. That, after all, is where one could pick up the mass of Chinese ceramics, which we find in Makassar graves, and which were paid for, in my view, by surplus rice. You've got to put it in context. Somehow, Makassar sailors visiting Sumatra also picked up the idea of writing, or perhaps Sumatrans brought it to Makassar, but in my view, it's much easier to think of people from Makassar going to Sumatra. But it was not a straight transfer. After all, we are talking about different languages, Malay or some version of it over in Sumatra, and Makassar language in Sulawesi. Critically, the Macassars realized that for Makassar language, you could work purely with aksaras that rendered consonant vowel only. There was no means of killing the vowel and writing a k. You have to write ka or ki or whatever. Provision of consonant vowel alone was close enough because in Makassar and Bugis, as it turned out, syllables can only end with an open vowel, a nasal or a glottal stop, and a reader has to guess which one is needed. One compares the 19th century, yes, here we go, Lampung aksaras with the 17th century Old Makassar aksaras, one can see a passing similarity. Very significantly, both systems share a distinctive order of the aksaras. On this side, 1 and 2, these are Lampung scripts, known from the 19th century, though some are said to come from older manuscripts. Here are Old Makassar languages. These ones are from signatures on the big treaty that Makassar signed with the Dutch, the Treaty of Bongaya. These ones happen to turn up in names, so that's why it's not a complete set. But here are complete sets from the 19th century. Now, you have to look a bit carefully to see that there are passable similarities. Here's pa, for example, which looks much like that. Ba, again, looks much the same across there. And you can imagine various others, but they're there. Sa is another one down here, which is fairly convincing. But you can see the order, and the order is really important. So that's got us from Sumatra to Old Makassar. Then it gets interesting. You have to get from Old Makassar to Bugis. This involves keeping the same system with a few minor extensions, such as an extra vowel sign, because it's an extra vowel in Bugis rather than Makassar. And crucially, the same order, but devising radically new forms for the aksharas based on diagonal lines and dots. So here's pa, for example. That's my drawing of the, on the right hand, you should get the Bugis akshara. I don't know why it's not working. It doesn't matter. The central thing is pretty much the akshara from pa. And then you can see ba, but which is just the same thing, more or less, turned upside down. And then after pa, ba, ma, you get, after pa and ba, you get ma, then you get ta, where it's just a V and then it's turned upside down. And then you get da and na. You add a dot and turn it upside down. It's not time to show you the whole process, but you get the idea. Shape of the akshara follows the order in the sequence. It's easy to say the ABC, which just emphasizes how much we depend on the order of ABC for all sorts of things. So this is the Kaganga order. Now, Caldwell's work on the Bugis genealogies suggests that this must have happened about 1400 AD. That's not quite the end of the matter. The various Philippine scripts, that's Makassar to Bugis, various Philippine scripts derived from Makassar and were used in the Philippines when the Spanish arrived in the middle of the 16th century. The oldest actual specimens of any of these scripts are found in the Spanish archives from the 16th century. In the 17th century, there was a takeoff of Old Makassar down to Bima. That's the green arrow there. And later the various Lontara-derived scripts in Sumbawa and in Ende, the blue ones there. Because Bugis script was so easy to use, it slowly came to replace Old Makassar, which is now only found in a few manuscripts. And finally, on scripts, let me demonstrate the world's most efficient script in action. Here's a simple diary entry by La Patau, the King of Boné, for the 24th of February, 1706. See how precise and detailed one can be. He was spending a couple of weeks up the coast from his base near Makassar. Oh, this won't demonstrate it to you. I'm sorry. I don't know what's happened. Up the top, you have 13 aksaras and a mark at the end. 13 aksaras, 7 vowel marks, and 1 punctuation. If you transcribe it into Bugis, it turns into 30 letters, 4 word divisions, and 1 punctuation. If you translate it into Indonesian, and this is from a published version, came out the other day, 38 letters, 7 word divisions, and 1 punctuation. That's full stop. In English, it just says, I went down net fishing in the Sagari River. He was just off fishing for the day. But that takes 35 letters, 7 word divisions, and 1 punctuation, compared to 13 aksaras, 7 vowel marks, and 1 punctuation. And the information transfer in each of these lines is exactly the same. So how does South Sulawesi upset ideas about Indonesian history? Let me suggest a few. Most obviously, the story of the past, as seen from South Sulawesi, downplays any central role for Java. In fact, it is hard to pick up much influence from Java in Sulawesi. I admit there's a little. But as Honda, the Dutch scholar who counted up Sanskrit words in various Indonesian languages, remarked, most of the handful of such words in Bugis or Makassar could have come as easily through Malay as through Javanese. And insofar as there are cultural and religious influences from Western archipelago in Sulawesi, the linkages are more usually with the Malay world, as, for example, in the matter of scripts or Islam, so on. If one is looking for a common theme across the archipelago, it's to be found in the concepts of Austronesian speakers relating to precedence, voyaging, kinship. Jim Fox goes on endlessly about kinship terminology, and so on. One hardly needs to make this point at ANU, but even if much American scholarship still doesn't quite get the Austronesians. I don't know why. These American scholars, they just don't get it. Almost 100 years ago, Schrieker, the Dutch historian of early Java, remarked, and it's a really good quote, there's a risk of arousing the impression that before the Hindu-Javanese period, there was a vacuum, which was then filled by elements of Indian culture. A vacuum which was then filled by Indian culture. Well, just perhaps pre-Indian Java looked a bit like South Sulawesi. One can certainly see resemblances out in the Pacific, in Tonga or Hawaii or wherever. Then we have the matter that both periodization of South Sulawesi history, the economic base of local states, are distinctive. As Racing pointed out long ago, there was no 350 years of colonial domination across the archipelago. Real Dutch power in South Sulawesi lasted barely 40 years. Moreover, Sulawesi produced no spices of interest to the wider world, even if Makassar briefly served in the 17th century as a market centre. And iron from early Luwu seems to have been an important export item for a while before it was eclipsed by Chinese iron, while rice was always a useful export. It's a completely different sort of economy. A notable example of an industry and trade outside European control was trepang from about 1700 to about 1900. This involved collection and processing by Macassars on distant shores, even to Australia, and then sale in Makassar to Chinese interests and export to China. And in the late 18th and much of the 19th century, this was the main business carried on in the city of Makassar. This was the main business, as we know from Heather's work and so forth. Lastly, there's the sheer bulk of Bugis and Makassar heritage in literature, historiography, political, religious, and legal thought. Much of this is still locked up in Lontara sources, but as it slowly emerges, its autonomy and distinctiveness are clear. In recent years, one of the interesting things is the use of Lontara axaras has taken off as design elements on fabrics, as advertising, also in advertising slogans and street signs in Makassar, even if few of the people can actually read them. But the message of using axaras on your shirt or to advertise your business is quite clear. We are not Javanese. That's the message. And Heather Sutherland has entitled her long-awaited grand history of Makassar and South Sulawesi, generally from about 1600 to 2018. She's entitled it An Indonesian History. It is not the history of Indonesia, but it is one history among many. And where have I heard that phrase before? So that's all I want to say. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Campbell, for the very thoughtful and very insightful talk. So we will now open the floor for questions. So for the first round, let's take 2 questions here from the. Oh, no. Oh, okay. Yeah. Let's take 2 questions from the in-person. And those joining online, please type questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and Mbak Chacha and sorry, but Chris will read them out. Okay, 2 questions. Yes, Pak Keith and Pak Greg. Yes.
Thanks, that was great, Camden. I think I now understand the difference between Makassar with 1 S and 2 S.
Good. Well done.
It's a new one. But my question really is in terms of the trade of the Bugis seafarers, which has been extensive throughout the archipelago. You mentioned sort of the Aksara and other cultural icons going to the trade with Lumpur, with Flores and Sumbawa. But do you have a comment about the sort of wider impact or even the wider spread of South Sulawesi-based seafarers throughout the Indonesian archipelago?
Yeah. Remembering, of course, that most Bugis and Makassar are farmers. They're not seafarers. But there have, of course, been voyaging all around the archipelago. These are Austronesians, and if there's one thing Austronesians know how to do, it's to sail. They got to Easter Island, after all. That sailing around the archipelago is a bit of a cake if you can go to Easter Island. But clearly where there are opportunities for contact with islands and where there was an economic reason to do so, people sailed. So, as you say, Lampung's one thing. In the 19th century, when the Dutch were beginning to exert some control over the whole archipelago, over most of the archipelago, or the key centres of the archipelago, there emerged this opportunity, particularly when Singapore opened up, for Bugis and Makassar to go to Singapore and distribute the stuff that was flowing into Singapore through archipelago, relatively small scale, but cumulatively it was a lot. People talk about the Bugis, but one needs to remember the Makassar as well, because these get confused when you're outside the archipelago. Probably one Makassar going to Malaysia, but everyone talks about the Bugis in Malaysia. Everyone in Australia talks about the Macassars in Australia, but there was clearly a mixture everywhere. So it's just taking up possible economic niches as continues more or less to the present, you know.
Thank you, Campbell, for the presentation. So I've got 2 very quick, very contrasting questions. First one is production iron in Lubu. Do we know anything about why that became an iron production area? Was the technology imported from elsewhere, or was it being developed locally? And the importance, as you were saying later, for life population in the south. The question about Lubu and its industry. And the second question is regarding what you're saying about the significance of South Sulawesi history in Indonesia, but much more broadly. How is this reflected in Indonesian history book now? Because we've just had the culture ministry, which was very controversial. History said that so is any of this increased significance of South Sulawesi reflected in the official histories of the school that have been produced by the
Thank you, Greg. On the first question, we really don't know how technology is transferred, and it was a pretty simple technology of smelting the iron and so on. And there was nickel in it, of course, up in Lake Matano, where Sorowako is. So there was lots of, it was very interesting ore to start with, other ore deposits in Lul. But these, after all, were Austronesians coming with a whole range of technological things. They were metal users from other in Southeast Asia, elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So we can't say, yes, this is specifically where it came from, except in general prehistory, this is a using period where people were smelting metal all over the place. We can't specify. On the second question, it's actually made an impact yet. I don't know. I haven't actually had a look in the new history to find out, but I should. Somebody else might know whether it features. I doubt that it does. That's my impression. But as I say, history can always be revised. There can be the next one, the next iteration of Indonesian history.
There's this first Lontara festival started in 2020. I don't know whether that one.
Oh,
yeah.
There's lots of celebration in South Sulawesi itself.
Yeah, the first Lontara festival was introduced. At the same time, the Perda regional regulation was issued on Lontara, the use of Lontara in 2020. I don't know whether that also.
But does that apply in Java? The people in Java learn about Sulawesi.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
In the way that people in Sulawesi learn about Java.
Java, exactly. Yeah.
That's.
If I may add a little bit, I reckon when I was in elementary school back in like 90, we studied a local, like a local cultures knowledge, and we studied about Aksara as well at school, and the folklore a little bit about that. I don't know about now. Perhaps they still do.
It's always been studied a bit in Sulawesi. That's not the question.
Regarding the revision, I don't know about the archaeology, and lately my friends are in the community doing sort of supply. And they kind of put it much because lately one of the road art, they also are in the roads, one is on the basis of the trying to bring it up.
Okay. Yeah.
Marcus.
So we have question from Pa Ed and also 2 questions online. So let's start from Pa Ed first. Yeah.
Thanks. You mentioned that part of your mission was to connect the ceramics, the study of ceramics to the textual evidence. Then you didn't talk so much about ceramics. So could you just give us a brief sort of picture of how that fits into understanding what kind of evidence does that produce? What does it tell us?
Particularly in the Makassar speaking areas, they I have to get to, they were originally cremating bodies, but then in about 1200 they started interring bodies in the graves, bodies, and with the bodies they put large quantities of ceramics. It's a bit different in the Bugis areas where they were still cremating people, but they were still burying ceramics with the ashes and things. Now, what happened starting in the 1930s, people discovered that if you went around with a big long iron pole, you can push in the ground, went and bong, you'd hit some ceramics. So you dug them up and you put them on the antique market where they flooded. I mean, I remember seeing them for sale in Manukau, but the best bits went to Tokyo, certainly. So that but you always broke some. Some got broken. So that, and then in the 1970s, this actually was brought under very good control by the Archaeological Service, by Hadi Mulyono and so forth. It was closed down, there was good control. But you could go around collecting potsherds, go to a village and say, take me to your illegal diggings. And if you collected a couple of hundred potsherds, which was just there on the surface. Most recent ones would be most numerous, but you could statistically correct for that. And so you could find that there were the, say, 15th century potsherds. And so you could see that this place had been occupied in the 15th century. Then you could go to a historical source and find out that, yes, there were people, there was a lord of this particular place because place names stayed the same. And he or she married someone over there in another 15th century place, or they deserted it. One of the best examples is Goa and Talo, Makassar things, because in the 15th century, there was an argument in the court of Goa, and someone took off in a huff and founded Talo, and you can see this reflected in the distribution of potsherds. What David Bulbeck did is there's a fantastic map of the whole area he surveyed in the Goa plain, with here all here's how it was settled in the 13th century. Here's settlement in the 14th century. Here's settlement in the 15th century, and so on. It's very convincing. You can see the densification of settlements, and they're not just half a dozen settlements. There are dozens and dozens of settlements because he painstakingly did a huge area and trained up a whole bunch of people who've become the archaeologists of today. Does that explain? I mean, it requires a huge amount of really detailed work. And no archaeologist could possibly have dug up all the illegal diggings. I mean, there have been some controlled diggings, but you know, everywhere there were uncontrolled diggings.
Thank you so much, Pak Campbell. And we have two questions online. Mbak Caca.
So the first one is a comment from Professor James Fox. Congratulations, Campbell, on marvelous presentations. It would benefit from a mention of the Bajau people. And then the second question is coming from Yusuf from Hasanuddin University, Makassar. Was the Jangan-Jangan script used alongside the Lontara script? Some scholars, such as Professor Matulada, in his book Latoa, argue that the Lontara script was a modified of the Jangan-Jangan script. However, other scholars suggest that the two scripts were used concurrently. Which is your view? What is your view on this matter?
First, about the Bajau or sea nomads and so forth. Yes, they're an important part of the story, particularly in Makassar Strait, and I think in contacts between Makassar and the Philippines, and now, of course, they're found in Southeast Sulawesi and so forth. That they're another and different actor in this whole story that I didn't have time to go into. And there's been really good work done on Bajau in recent years, several histories of them. On the use of Jangan-Jangan and Lontara, that's what I think we have now discovered. We have discovered the actual story. Of course, the Jangan-Jangan was used to write Makassar, and then when Lontara came along, it actually replaced them because the Lontara axaras are much simpler to use. They're much simpler in format, whereas the Jangan-Jangan ones are a bit elaborate. But a few people today can still read Jangan-Jangan, and it's easy enough to learn. You just have to sort of work at it. But I'm sorry, I don't understand why you won't read my script. The Bugis font, I think.
It's not here.
No,
It's not there.
Oh,
it's not. That's the problem. So I can't show you what Lontara looked like in detail.
and Yeah, we have questions from Pak Acho, our expert in Lontar, and also Pak Holil and Masnya after that. Okay, Pak Acho.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Campbell. You also didn't mention about Toraja. Are they less consequential?
They're the people up in the hills. There are not so many of them. They didn't have an economy to get involved in the wider world. So, of course, they're important, but they don't have the amount of heritage, my last point. They don't have manuscripts and so forth. They're basically, yes, the people up in the hills. And tremendously interesting. I'm not, they're going for funerals, not weddings.
Yeah, Campbell, thanks. A bit related to what Heath asked you, the movement of people, what about the movement in? So where did, where was Transmigrasi in South Sulawesi one? I mean, what about ethnic Chinese traders and Arab traders and other movement of people coming in, not just going out?
Well, there's some Transmigrasi up in Luwu,
Yeah.
quite a bit up there, and in West Sulawesi and so forth. I don't think there's any Transmigrasi in the sort of fertile centre of the peninsula. I don't remember seeing any there. Yes, you get Chinese in Makassar, directing a lot of the trade, particularly from the 18th century on, and Heather has a lot about that. You get Arabs from the Hadramaut bringing Muslim ideas and influencing Islam, but the whole story of Islam in South Sulawesi is a great saga that somebody, well, actually quite a bit has been done, but there's a lot more to be done on it. After all, it's from Sulawesi that Sheikh Yusuf came, and the veneration of Sheikh Yusuf and our whole story. But there's lots more. And Wahyudin Halim, who did his PhD, was talking about Asadiyya in Singkang today and the importance of Asadiyya and Asad al-Bugisi. So there's a lot more to say about history.
Has it changed? I mean, the impacts on society, the economy, is there a big story to tell there, or are they fairly small numbers in aggregate?
I think they're very centralised in towns, and not just Makassar. In all the towns in the peninsula, you find some Chinese and so forth. But that's history, as it were. That's relatively straightforward. And Heather has. I haven't got that far in the book yet,
Sure.
But she'll have endless detail about all this.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is about Islamization of South Sulawesi. So, does South Sulawesi upset any ideas about the Islamization of the Indonesian archipelago? But so far, I mean, our idea of Islamization of Indonesia sometimes centers too much on Java and how what is Songo, this Wayang, and this story and how there has been syncretism with local culture. Was a similar thing happening in South Sulawesi, or is there all different things going on?
There's one really interesting difference in South Sulawesi. That is clearly in the 16th century, there were some Muslims, particularly maybe from Malacca, coming, making contact around the coast and so forth. So there were Muslims there. But then in 1605, to simplify, the court of Goa, the main Makassar state, officially became Muslim, and Tallow at the same time, and in fact Luwu at the same, a few days earlier. But Goa in particular became Muslim officially, with the ruler of attending the mosque and all that sort of stuff. Now, politically, Goa was dominant. So Goa then imposed Islam by force of arms on the other states. I've forgotten all the dates, but a couple of years later, Wajo, and then in 1611, Bone, by direct military force. And that's most unusual elsewhere. Then each of those states had their own Islamic history, of course. In Bono, there was a big argument between one queen and her son about how Sufi he could be. And so that there were squabbles there. So there are internal squabbles. But what's really interesting and significant, in fact, in terms of Islam worldwide, is here's a rare case of where Islam was imposed by military force.
We have 2 questions online and one question. Yeah, we start with the online questions and then it's after that.
Online questions still coming from Yusuf about Jangan script. First one, was the Jangan script used alongside the Lontaras? Sorry. The first one, why does the Jangan script appear to have disappeared? Modern narratives often attribute its decline to the outcome of the Makassar War and the growing influence of Bugis power following the defeat of Makassar. Are there any plausible historical explanations for its disappearance? And then the second question, have you ever encountered the oldest known Bugis or Makassaris manuscripts? And if so, which script was used in them? Today, manuscripts written in Jangan script seem to be extremely rare, whereas Lontara manuscripts are much more common. What is your perspective on this issue?
First thing about Jangan and Lontara, they were clearly in use together for some time. People don't use them today because Jangan is more complicated script. But a good example is in 1839, there were some French visitors to Makassar and they got taken to the court of Goa. We know the details, but don't matter. They noticed that there were 2 scripts in use and that they are clearly Jangan and Lontara at the same time in 1839 in the court of Goa. Lontara just gradually replaced Jangan in my view. And that seems to explain what we have. And it's true, there are not many Jangan manuscripts around today. The oldest one, that's a really interesting question. One can find some 18th century manuscripts, but it's really hard to find 17th century manuscripts. And one can find some things like the Dutch treaty with signatures on it in Jangan. There's a brick out of the fortress in Makassar that has Jangan script on it, though it's a very weird Jangan script. It looks like nothing else, but it is legible, and so on. It's a long process of just replacement. Were they all the questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
The manuscript written in Jangan script seems to be extremely
Yeah.
rare.
Yeah. So another one?
No, that's the 2 questions.
That's the question. Okay, yeah.
Something that's very important to mention. So my question is about who's upsetting in the ideas of Indonesian history. Do you find that you're only replacing, in my thinking, that you're only replacing the ideas of Java-centric ideas of Indonesian history to another elite context of Indonesian history? I mean, because the entire presentation is only centered around legal text, and then the sex evolution is also Lontara script, which are mainly centered on the elite level. So I want to push for the previous questions to how do you see that the constructions of the history itself is only, only centered on the Alice.
I'm not wanting to say anything relating to Java is wrong. What I'm wanting to do is to say that Indonesian history is richer. There's more in it than people want to sometimes recognise. There's actually an interesting, well, a bit more than that. If you see Indonesia as being largely an Austronesian area, an area of Austronesian speakers and Austronesian culture. Now, I know that, there are bits of it are not in Halmahera and Papua and so on, but most of it has Austronesian ideas. That actually helps in seeing Indonesia a bit more richly, if you like, and also sees that the Indian cultures came to not a vacuum, as Shrika was warning against, but actually people who had ideas and social relations and all sorts of things their own. It actually, in some ways, helps to put Indonesians, or at least Austronesian-speaking Indonesians, in the centre of the picture. It's, in my view, a better way of looking at the situation. And I don't want to be too hard on Hindu Javanese stuff, which is fantastic and interesting. But there are other aspects of Indonesian history.
Mbak Tika and yeah.
Just a quick question on is it something that is still in practice nowadays, or can you explain what is the similarity with other more contemporary oral form? Because I'm trying to picture myself. I'm also part of the people in Java who are not very educated about the South Sulawesi history. So can you talk a bit more about that? Yeah?
As far as I know, and I've asked about this, there's no one alive today who can orally perform. Must have been in the 1970s, I think, Sergio Kohlhoff managed to record two old people in Sopeng who could do it in a simple way. What he did, he recorded them telling a particular episode, which was used for weddings particularly, twice on the same day, and then once again the next week. And then he found a manuscript in the village which dealt with the same thing. And he was able to go through word for word. And on the same day, they thought they were saying the same thing, of course, but showing the differences between what they said in the morning and what they said in the afternoon. So we actually have, it's really precious, this recording that Sergio did in I think the 70s. I've just forgotten when it is. What you will find now today in festivals and things is some old person with a manuscript reading the manuscript out loud. But that's slightly different. That's not really being able to magaligo to do it. But there are the manuscripts, thousands of them.
Thank you. So one of your themes was that there's not much evidence for connections with or influence from Java. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more why that is, because during the period you're writing and you're talking about, there were powerful kingdoms in Java, there were big port cities in Java, they're going to Lampung, you mentioned connections with Malacca, Bima. It's like there's a big hole in the middle there. So why not more connection with Java?
Well, I might have overemphasized the lack of connection with Java. I mean, after all, a few Sulawesi names get included in the sort of geographical list in the Deshavarna of 1365. But people have built up far more about that. I mean, they say, oh, this is Javanese domination of Sulawesi. It's not. The poet just had to make up these names and fit them to the meter, for goodness sake, And it was complicated Sanskrit meter and all the rest of it. And he was just picking names out of the air. So yes, at least in Java they knew some of these names, and there are things like there are some bronze statues that are clearly Javanese that have been discovered in particularly in Bantaeng down the south. And yes, you can pick up odd words and things which really do look Javanese and so on. But the other thing is that the trade that was going on was, of course, after spices. I mean, everyone in North Java and South Sumatra, they wanted spices. So you don't get so much record about where the rice came from for South Sumatra. If you're in Palembang or somewhere, you actually want rice, and it's easier to bring it from Sulawesi than to bring it from up the backwoods in Sumatra somewhere. I think it's a question of moving one's view a little bit and not thinking that everything starts in the West and the West dominates everything, but to realise that, yes, there were people moving all over the place. And our knowledge is dependent upon the sorts of sources that we have. This is Jara Sastruan's theme song, that the sources that we have determines what we think we know. And when there are external sources, whether they're Dutch or even Chinese or English or whatever, they're interested in trade. But there were other things going on other than trade. They were stealing babies and all that sort of stuff.
Any other questions? Sarah, yeah.
I'm very worried about this sort of fields question. So you mentioned the Hollandians first came and then the Australians came from. So what happened to the earlier people who came to Japan, archipelago, were they kind of wiped out?
Basically, yes.
You know,
Well, that's the big question. They were in Java they were Homo erectus. In Flores they were Homo floresiensis. That may be derived from Homo erectus or something like that. And then Luzon. In Sulawesi, there are all the stone tools that are like the stone tools in Flores and so forth. And we know that there was someone around there perhaps more than 1 million years ago. So they must have been derived from Homo erectus or something like that on the Asian mainland, and that includes Java, of course, with sea levels going up and down.
So we still have a bit of time. So I have 2 questions on Lagaliga, but Campbell, I was just wondering, in the Austronesian speaking societies, do we have other like large literature like Lagaliga? That's one. And then the second one, how should we understand Lagaliga? It is more than literature. It is like a cultural model of society, cosmology, status. How should we understand Lagaliga now? Should we see it as a history, but perhaps not like modern history or mythology or something else entirely?
Sorry, what was your first point?
Oh, in the Austronesian speaking societies, do we have also?
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, there are. You can look in Austronesian societies. For example, stuff in Hawaii, when the first Europeans went there, they talk about bards, talking about long poems and so on. If you go into Kalimantan, there are long stories of voyaging and so forth. What's it called? The thing that Derek Freeman was connected with, the Way of the Gods or something, where he transcribed one, or he got one transcribed, and it's recognizably the same thing. There's sort of tribal encyclopedias that have upper world, lower world, middle world, people acting in the model world. The stuff from Tonga, which you can see from the comments we have, but these are all unwritten, of course. The point about Lagaligo is it gets written down.
Yeah. And it's large.
But it's large. But this is one of the things that Austronesian societies do, like having presidents and building square houses and all the other things, and having kinship terms and so forth. They tell long stories about sometime in the past, lots of voyaging, precedents and so on. That's all there. The Lagaligo's just the one that we have best record of.
Yeah. And how should we understand
Now,
it?
how should we understand it? Well, Sergio Kolhoff says you've got to remember it was primarily entertainment.
Yeah.
It was that long, those long tropical nights. How do you fill them in? Well, you tell stories. That's in some ways the best way of understanding it. How can we understand? How can we today understand it? There's been attempts to understand it historically. Are these voyages actual voyages or something like that? Doesn't get very far. Christian Pelleras has tried quite hard to do this, and Christian's done wonderful work, other work on Lagaligo. Though it is interesting that China and Luwu do seem to feature fairly heavily, and we know about China and Luwu from other sources. One of the central episodes is where the Saura Guarding from Luwu has to come to Alangkanange to win the hand of Wechudai. But you have to have a boat to go from Luwu to Wajo, and so you have to build the boat, which means you have to chop down the tree to build the boat, and these are elaborate stories. If we want to read them as literature today, then I think we have to understand how they were created, to see, are they any good? Now, if you compare them with Homer, one of the most terrible cultural crimes that I can remember is the Penguin translator of the Odyssey and the Iliad, who translated it into prose. So if you've ever been subjected to E.V. Rieur's translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're awful, they're dull. You need to translate it line by line, and you need to understand what the poet is doing, how he's using his materials with stock phrases and repetitive adjectives and so on. When you do that and you see the way the poem is being created, it's fantastic. I used to teach all this stuff years and years ago, and it's really good. So if you read bits of Lagaligo, you can see exactly the same thing going on, but you need to learn how to read the text in a proper way, and it's clearly like that. It just needs systematic analysis of a large chunk to show how it works.
Another usual comparison with Mahabharata, what do you think?
My understanding is Mahabharata, there are fixed texts. Quite where they came from, I don't know, but it's probably originally it must be the same sort of storytelling things.
In terms of the size,
Oh,
so large.
Well, size isn't. There's lots of stuff about Lagaligo is the longest poem in the world because it's 6,000 pages and all the rest of stuff. But in fact, it's a series of episodes. So it's not one thing. Each episode, each version of each episode is a work. This is getting into essay tentang philology boogies, which is a book that we know about. But it's not one chunk, as it were. What you have is one person performing orally or on paper, his version of that episode. But you have an awful lot of them. And they all fit within this overall structure of whether it's the creator at the beginning of the world creating the world and sending down people into the middle world and so on, or whether it's so regarding chasing around after Wait You Die and having cockfights and all sorts of things, or whether it's right at the end of the story where everyone gets taken up into the upper world at the end. So there is an episode, a great narrative story.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. We only have 2 minutes and so yes, please.
I want to add something back when I was a kid. I remember like the elderly like to sing a lullaby, kind of a short stories of taken from the Legal or other. It's in really as well, like young Fado kind of like.
Yeah. It's really as Macassar sort of equivalent.
Fantastic. So, please, thank you so much, Professor Campbell, for the fabulous talk and for being so generous for answering our questions. Thanks so much, Campbell. And as we conclude, I would like to remind you all, as the one of the conveners for the Indonesia, I'm advertising. It's one of the conveners